Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Risen for PC and Xbox 360. This is an action role-playing game from Piranha Bytes, who are the same people who developed the Gothic series, from Gothic 1 to 3 anyway. And it was interesting in that it was the first non-Gothic game that they did, and it still gets compared to Gothic anyway because of the way it plays. Now, I'll get to that more later on, but some people even seem to think that this is part of the Gothic series, but it really isn't. It's a completely different franchise. It just plays very similarly, so inevitably you're going to have comparisons drawn with the different aspects of gameplay. But another interesting thing to note is that this was a game that was released on both PC and Xbox 360, and in fact it was Piranha Bytes' first console title. And this presented a little bit of a problem. Apparently the Xbox 360 version is absolutely terrible. I don't know. I have the PC version, which is apparently vastly superior, even though it was released the year prior to the Xbox 360 version, which would have been 2009 for PC, then 2010 for Xbox 360. So apparently, even with additional development time, it still had a bunch of problems, like massive performance issues, tons of bugs and glitches. Apparently the controls were a mess on console. So if you're going to play this thing, apparently you need to play the PC version. So I didn't notice many of those issues on PC. I did notice a little bit of stuttering here and there where it seemed to load stuff in. But other than that, I really didn't have any issues with this thing on the technical side. So I have to wonder, why did they screw up the Xbox version so badly when the PC version is just fine? But I digress. Let's talk about the rest of the game. Starting with, of course, the presentation, which is kind of mixed. On the one hand, you have superb environmental graphics with tons of detail packed into things, and it has this really nice visual style that mixes a tropical environment when you get closer to the coastlines with just a forested island that's full of wildlife in it. That's kind of a cool thing too, as well as pirate architecture mixed in with medieval fantasy, in particular with Harbor Town. And that's just kind of a weird contrast, but I can dig it. And then they also have this otherworldly quality that comes in much later on in the game, and it gives you quite a bit of variety in the environments, and it really helps to just immerse you. And then you have the character modeling and animation, which is on the one hand, women are modeled very oddly in this particular game. I don't know why they're so misshapen, but they are. And then, of course, the men are, well, big and burly and look quite silly. Except for your guy, who looks kind of like a doofus. I mean, the other guys are sporting handlebar mustaches and mutton chops, and you're just this guy who's basically got a shaved head and in tattered clothing and looks like he has a ridiculous expression on his face all the time. But that's beside the point. The modeling is just a little bit misshapen, and proportions are quite off sometimes. I don't really know what they were going for with it, but oh well. Anyway, the animations are a little bit of a problem. On the one hand, you have the interaction graphics, where they're interacting with various objects, like, say, cauldrons, or they're mining something. And the animations tend to be kind of stiff and robotic in that regard. But when you go into combat, they're smoother. And they chain together quite nicely, and they actually flow pretty well. So it's kind of a weird contrast there. It's like they couldn't figure out what they wanted to do all the time, or they just didn't finish certain animations. It's not that huge of a deal, but sometimes you notice and you're like, wait, ugh. But anyway. And then, of course, you have the sound design, which is also a little bit all over the place. The music is pretty solid stuff. They've got a nice mix of just this exploration kind of music that is generally kind of calm, but at the same time, there's this dark quality to it, because the overarching story of this game is pretty dark, actually. So, I mean, at least in theme, it's not necessarily dark in how it actually comes out, but it's a pretty dark theme to it. So you have this kind of quality to the music when you're exploring the island that gives it this sense like it's this lush environment, but there's this dangerous quality to it, so you have to be careful. And then, of course, there's the other music as well, which is it works okay. The combat music's kind of standard stuff, and that's really all you need to know about it. And then there's the voice acting. The most noteworthy character in this game is, of course, Don Esteban, because he's voiced by John Rhys Davies. If you don't know who that is, Gimli. Yes, John Rhys Davies is in this game, and he's freaking awesome. He's pretty much the only good voice acting in the entire game, actually, and even then, he's a little bit stiff in his delivery sometimes, so that's a little bit of a problem. The rest of the voice acting is just kind of eh. It's not as bad as previous Gothic games, for instance, but it's certainly not stellar voice acting by any stretch of the imagination. But what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this one takes place on Piranha Island, where you play as an unnamed castaway who's shipwrecked there during a horrible storm. You come to find out later on that these storms are happening all over the world, they're extremely destructive, and that somehow Piranha Island's immune to them. And so the mystery of how Piranha is immune to these things actually is the main crux of the storyline, and it ends up involving the Titans. Now, the Titans were a remnant of this era, apparently, when the gods still ruled the world. Somehow man managed to drive out the gods. I don't know, it doesn't explain it, it doesn't make any sense, to be honest with you, but somehow mankind drove the gods away. And they left the Titans behind. And the Titans are now causing all sorts of trouble. So, that's really the main point of the storyline, and that doesn't actually become clear until later on. It starts out acting like the storyline is between the Don and the Inquisition. Now, Don Esteban and his men are portrayed to be freedom fighters at the beginning of the game. They're like, oh, if you want freedom, go with the Don. If you want to be oppressed, go with the Inquisition. Because the Inquisition are basically just grabbing everybody they can and taking them to the monastery and press-ganging them into service, really. You get recruited. And so it makes it act like that, but when you explore these factions more, you really find out there are no good guys in this game. At all. In fact, there are only shades of gray. Nobody is a good guy. At all. I mean, even your player character isn't a good guy or a bad guy. He's just there. And he has his own motivations and such. But anyway, the Don's men are basically thugs, and the Inquisition, while they are kind of oppressive, are trying to maintain order. So, you have these two sides of the coin, and while they both maintain order, they do it in different ways. So, it's interesting to note that, and how people react to things differently depending on what's going on. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And that's one thing that Piranha Bytes has always been really good at. They've never been portraying things as clearly one side or the other. They've always managed to put everything in shades of gray very well. So they've done that well. The problem is, the main overarching storyline isn't very good. Because it's incoherent early on, obviously. I mean, it makes it act like, hey, there's nothing really going on. The whole first chapter of the game, you don't know what's going on with the storyline. There are 4 chapters in this game. And the first full chapter, which I spent about, 20 hours on? Yes, 20 hours, because I was doing all the side stuff in the first chapter, mostly. But I spent about 20 hours in this thing just wandering around and experiencing all the side quests and stuff. But when I actually got to the meat of the storyline in Chapter 1, it was just between the two factions. There wasn't really anything relating to the overarching story until the second chapter on up to the end. So that's something to keep in mind. This game actually starts out pretty slow. So keep that in mind. Also, when you go actually to the gameplay segment, you find that there are advantages and disadvantages to joining each faction, because you can really only choose one or the other in this game. And that becomes actually kind of irrelevant later on in the game when things kind of diverge and everything comes together. So it doesn't really matter what side you choose except for how you're going to play the game. If you side with the Inquisition, you can become a mage. But the side quests you get when you're actually becoming a mage are really, really boring. Like, for instance, sweeping the floors. I'm not joking. This is a side quest in this game. You sweep the floors. And you'll do it, because you need the experience points. Badly. Really, you do. You need them badly. When you level up in this game, you get 10 learning points, but I'll get to that later on. But the Inquisition quests are really boring early on, and so that's kind of a problem. If you side with the Don's men, then you'll probably be a fighter or a hunter, which means you'll be using bows and crossbows, and of course swords and axes and stuff like that. But you won't be able to cast spells unless you have scrolls. So you have to keep that in mind. You also have to keep in mind that this game is mage-centric. As in, most of the puzzle solutions in this game well, not really puzzle solutions. Puzzle solutions are actually really easy. I'll get to that in a moment. But when you're solving death traps, usually the solution to these problems is either use the telekinesis spell or use the levitation spell. I'm not joking. These are the two things you need to do. There's also a spell that will turn you into a nautilus, which is basically like a lobster crab thing. It's kind of hard to really describe it. It's weird. But you turn into one of those and you can go into small areas, and where you couldn't obviously get as just a normal sized person. So it's weird. You have this mage-centric game, and it doesn't really make it apparent to you until you've played through it as someone who isn't a mage. Because I didn't spend a single learning point on upping my wisdom. You get 3 stats in this game: strength, dexterity, and wisdom. Wisdom being your spellcasting skill. And I didn't spend a single learning point on wisdom at all in this game. I did not cheat to up my stats, by the way. And still, I ended the game with 194 wisdom. The max level you can get by actually leveling up your skills in these manners is 100. I was 94 points over the normal limit on wisdom. I didn't spend a single point in it. That should tell you something. This game is mage-centric, and it's painfully obvious. Meanwhile, you're playing as a warrior or something, and you're just getting annihilated. Granted, spellcasting in this game isn't all that great, to be honest with you. I mean, there are a few spells that are kind of cool, but they're just not all that impressive. But when you're fighting as a warrior, you get this definite skill progression, where you get tougher and tougher and tougher as you go along, and the more you learn the ins and outs of combat, the better things are. I mean, this game has a really timing-based combat system, which is one of the better ones I've seen in action role-playing games to date, where everything has to be timed perfectly. And there is a little bit of room for error, don't get me wrong, but it's really down to whether you can place a blow at the right time, or whether you can block at the right time, counter at the right time, all of which are based on your skills, of course. And it makes the combat very difficult. So when you're playing as a mage and you're using a staff, then it's a little bit different, because you're not going to be doing anywhere near as much damage as you would with a sword or an axe or something like that. So you have to keep that in mind. An interesting thing to note about the skills for fighting with swords and axes and such, by the way, eventually you can use two-handed weapons with one hand, which is really weird, but it's kind of handy, because when you're using them with two hands, they're really slow, and when you're using it with one hand, it's not really slow, it's just kind of moderately slow. Anyway, I digress. As you up your skills, you're going to get better and better at combat. You're going to have more moves available to you. Eventually you'll get power attacks, different chaining moves that you can do, like lateral blows, for instance, counter maneuvers, stuff like that. All of which is dependent on your skills, which you spend learning points on. And you also have to spend gold to learn these skills. This is kind of an archaic thing for role-playing games, but it works out okay in this one, mostly because it makes sense. I mean, this guy's not going to just teach you a skill just out of goodness or something. You're going to have to pay him for it. So it makes sense. Granted, you're going to need a lot of gold. And I mean a lot of gold. Now, granted, by the end of the game, you've got plenty of gold. In fact, you've got way too much gold. But early on, you're going to be scrambling for as much gold as possible. I recommend thieving skills. I'm not joking. This game really kind of requires you to be a thief. So it's weird about that. But anyway, the higher your thief skills are, the more locks you can pick and stuff like that. So that it's really handy early on. But it's interesting to note you can also craft things, and this is also a pretty decent way of earning money. Because if you find, say, iron ore, then you can get steel blanks for making swords, and of course that's really helpful for you. And interesting to note as well, the crafted weapons are generally better than most of the stuff you can find on your own. So you have to keep that in mind when you're playing this game as well. There's not going to be much better than what you craft, at least early on, especially bad, because you're not able to use two-handed weapons with one hand yet. But makes it really hard to fight animals, because they can only be blocked with a shield. and so that means one-handed weapons means you're not going to be doing as much damage. Anyway, so you have these different nuances to the game, and you have the fact that if you're going to play as a mage, you're going to play, you just had to side with the Inquisition. That's the only way to do it. And the game's mage-centric, so that's a little bit of a problem. And the fact that you have to pay for everything, and you need tons of gold for that. Now, when you get to the middle and end of the game, this isn't a problem at all, don't get me wrong. But early on, it's a really big problem. The game is brutal in difficulty at the beginning. It's just absolutely brutal until you learn the ins and outs. You learn not to just take on big enemies by yourself. In fact, you will constantly be leading them back into your into friendly units to take them out, which can get pretty amusing, to be honest with you. But anyway, so you have to play this game smart, and I think that's the reason why a lot of people don't like it. Because you can't just play this like, say, the Elder Scrolls, and just run in swinging your sword madly and actually just annihilate everything without a challenge. This game will challenge you. It's that simple. It will challenge you. And you have to be patient with it. You have to be slow and methodical. And yet, it still lets you do things. You can explore the island all you want. You might find an enemy that you will just have no chance at beating, of course. But you can explore all you want. And this is actually really nice, because when you're exploring, you'll actually find rewards. For instance, if you're fighting a particularly powerful enemy, then there's chances are he's hiding something good. So once you beat that enemy, and you get this immense satisfaction from annihilating this enemy that was just really powerful, and then you find this stash of loot that's really good stuff, and you just feel great. And sometimes you'll even get side quests from just exploring. Like, for instance, I got one for the sword Stormwind. I found a piece of the sword Stormwind, and it gave me a quest to reforge the sword Stormwind. And when I found the other piece, I brought it back, I reforged the sword, gave me experience points, and a really good sword. So there's just all sorts of things that you have in this game. You'll explore all over the place. You'll find plants and such that you can use to make potions, some of which permanently increase your stats and life force and mana and all that sort of thing. One potion even gives you experience points. It's 100 experience points per potion, which is kind of weird, but anyway. There's all sorts of side quests. There's plenty of stuff to do in this game. A lot of it is a little bit of busy work, though, and that's kind of an issue sometimes, but not that big a deal. The game does drag very much at the beginning, but it picks up more later on, and it becomes very much a more enjoyable game in the latter half. But it still takes you a long time to get anywhere. You move kind of slow. And the day-night cycle is a little bit of a problem unless you turn the brightness really high, which isn't particularly easy on your eyes, but you can actually see what you're doing at night. Because the lighting system in this game is actually really good. And so you won't be able to see very far in front of you when it's pitch black. So you have to keep that in mind as well. Also keep in mind, the game is just completely unforgiving when you're going to play it. So, yeah, if you're just used to casual games, or you think, oh, I'm good at Oblivion, I can play Risen, you're going to need to be a lot more patient with it. So, knowing that it is a game for pretty much hardcore role-playing game fans, and knowing what they were trying to do with it, I'd say they succeeded pretty well for the most part, except for in the storyline being pretty pathetic and not doing very much to hold the game together. And there's some questionable motives on a lot of fronts. You're just sitting there like, well, why does he want to do this? What? Who? Why? And sometimes you'll get a little bit lost. This isn't a huge deal most of the time, because you can just ask around and eventually find out where you're going. Sometimes you'll find maps that you can figure out where you're going. You actually need maps in order to map out dungeons and such. That's kind of a pain, but anyway. So, it's definitely not for people who haven't played hardcore role-playing games before. Just keep that in mind. But for what it is, it's pretty good. I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.